Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into, well, a really complex, pretty fascinating topic. The future trajectory of U.S. global influence over the next, what, couple of decades?
Yeah, it's about understanding where a major global power might be headed.
Exactly.
And the source material you shared for this deep dive is perfect for that. It's a detailed analytical report, Future of the U.S. Empire 2025-2045.
It's pretty dense stuff.
It is, but it's exactly the kind of thing we can dig into, pull out the signal from the noise for you.
Absolutely. So our mission here is basically to extract the most critical insights, maybe some surprising facts, definitely the key trends from this report.
Right.
The goal, to give you a comprehensive but hopefully totally digestible understanding of how the U.S. is projected to, well, navigate the next 20 years on the global stage.
And right up front, the report lays out its core thesis. And it's maybe not what some might expect. It's not predicting like a sudden collapse of U.S. power.
No collapse.
Yeah. Instead, it sees a significant transformation of influence, a real shift.
Okay, so less about direct unilateral control everywhere and more about what wielding influence differently.
Exactly. In what the report calls an increasingly contested multipolar world. So it's a shift away from, let's say, brute force or simple territorial dominance towards influence anchored by things like soft power, financial architecture, technological supremacy, and a web of strategic alliances. The report frames it as less of a traditional empire and more of, and I like this phrase, an empire of protocols, platforms, and persuasion.
Empire of protocols. That is interesting. It really sets the stage for how the report sees the U.S. trying to maintain influence, but also facing some real constraints.
Yes, and the report's pretty clear about where those constraints come from. Externally, obviously, from rising global competitors, China's highlighted as the big one.
Right.
But also critically internal challenges, stuff happening right here within the U.S.
And it's those internal dynamics that the report gets into first, right?
Yes.
Looking at the political landscape.
Yeah, the tension it sees between polarization on one hand and maybe resilience on the other.
So what's the main point there?
Well, what the report really emphasizes is this increasing domestic ideological division. And it argues this isn't just, abstract political theory. No, it directly impacts the efficiency of governance. It potentially creates electoral volatility, which could weaken global confidence in the U.S. as, like, a stable, reliable partner.
It even mentions stressed state-federal relations, doesn't it? Fueled by culture wars.
Yeah, exactly. Things like abortion, gun control, immigration. These internal fights, the report argues, have external consequences.
So how does that connect to diplomacy?
Well, the report suggests this internal focus, this division, might lead to a shift, maybe towards a more pragmatic exceptionalism in foreign policy.
Pragmatic exceptionalism, meaning...
Potentially more transactional, maybe less focused on grand moralistic pronouncements about democracy abroad.
Okay. So less ideological crusading, perhaps more deal-making. But it's not all negative on the political system, is it?
No, despite all this internal friction, the report's outlook isn't entirely doom and gloom. It finds that core U.S. institutions...
Like the courts.
Right. The courts, individual states, civil society groups, these are seen as remarkably robust. They seem able to function even when there's gridlock at the top.
Okay, so that's a key point of resilience then. Political soft power, like the appeal of the Democratic brand, might stick around.
It persists, yeah. But the report seems to be saying that diminished credibility from all the domestic stuff could certainly limit that ideological influence internationally.
The brand's there, but maybe tarnished a bit.
Precisely. The recent track record just raises questions for other countries.
Okay, let's pivot then. From political to economic dynamics. The report breaks this down too, right? A push and pull between the debt burden and the U.S. as this, massive innovation engine.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at the strengths first, the report is pretty unequivocal. The U.S. is the epicenter of the innovation economy. We're talking about where the world's leading firms in AI, biotech, fintech, clean tech.
Yeah.
They're not just based here, they're fundamentally innovating here.
In financial dominance, still a big deal.
Crucial. The report highlights the dollar still made up, about 58% of global reserves in 2024? That's huge.
Wow.
And U.S. Treasury bonds, still seen as the global safe asset. People still flock to them.
And energy.
Energy independence is another major strength identified. The U.S. is dominant in LNG, shale gas, and it's rapidly building out renewables capacity, too.
Okay, but then come the challenge. And the report doesn't pull punches here, does it?
No, it doesn't. The national debt projection is... Well, it's staggering, exceeding 130% of GDP by 2035, according to the CBO.
130%. That's the Congressional Budget Office figure.
That's the one. And this raises a major concern in the report,
Hmm.
those rising interest payments on the debt. They could potentially crowd out other crucial domestic investments, the things needed for future growth.
Right. Makes sense.
It also flags deindustrialization. Notes the U.S. is lagging China in securing critical supply chains. Things like rare earths, EV batteries.
Yeah, we hear about that a lot.
Plus, there's this underlying potential for social unrest, fueled by inequality, cost of living crisis, especially if productivity gains aren't, shared more widely.
So what's the overall economic outlook then, according to the report?
Pulling it together, the forecast is that the U.S. probably remains central to global finance and entrepreneurship. However, and this is a big however,
Okay.
the report stresses that this domestic economic fragility could significantly reduce its capacity for, say, large-scale global intervention or big foreign aid spending. It impacts its ability to project economic power abroad.
Right, you can't fund everything if the house isn't fully in order. Okay, let's shift gears again. Military posture. The report sees the U.S. military staying incredibly capable, but maybe more selective.
That's the idea. The sheer scale right now is undeniable. You've got, 11 aircraft carrier strike groups? Over 750 bases in 80 countries. Ongoing modernization of the nuclear triad land, sea, air deterrent. That kind of global reach is just unmatched.
But the doctrine is changing. That's what the report says. It highlights a clear strategic pivot to the Indo-Pacific.
Yes, and that pivot is driven by factors like the rise of Chinese naval power, obviously, the increasing risks around Taiwan, the militarization happening in the South China Sea.
Makes sense. It also points to the growing dominance of tech warfare, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Areas like space command, cyber capabilities, autonomous systems, think advanced drones. These are becoming central to U.S. strategy.
And less focus on boots on the ground.
There's a noted preference, for engaging in proxy conflicts, relying more on intelligence support, drones, advisors, rather than deploying huge ground armies like in the past.
But even with that, so the outlook is still a major deterrent force, but maybe a more concentrated physical presence.
That seems to be it. Concentrated in key strategic zones. Indo-Pacific, the Arctic, critical Middle East choke points, and relying more heavily on tech advantages and alliances like NATO, US.
And that focus on tech brings us neatly to the next big dimension the report identifies as foundational for future influence: technological supremacy.
Yeah, they talk about AI, quantum computing,
Yeah.
even the potential for a next empire built on tech.
This is where the U.S. has some pretty unique strengths, according to the report, leading in several strategic tech frontiers.
For sure. In AI, for example, it's home to the big players. OpenAI, Google DeepMind, Anthropic, the ones developing those foundational models everyone's talking about.
Right. And quantum.
Quantum computing is another area. The report says the U.S. leads in patents and R&D through places like DARPA.
The Defense Research Agency.
Yeah, DARPA, IBM, major universities. And space, too. Think SpaceX, Blue Origin, alongside NASA and the Space Force. They're enabling significant orbital dominance.
The report uses this phrase, data empire. What's that about?
A compelling concept. It's about how U.S. companies control so much critical data infrastructure. Cloud services, advanced semiconductors, global payment networks.
And they set the standards.
And crucially, they often set the global standards.
Yeah.
Internet protocols, cybersecurity norms, app ecosystems. That control gives enormous influence.
But there are risks.
Oh yeah, substantial risks highlighted. The biggest one, supply chain dependency on Taiwan's TSMC for the most advanced chips.
That's the big one, a major vulnerability.
Definitely. And the report also points to regulatory lag inside the U.S., establishing clear rules for AI safety, ethical deployment.
We're kind of behind on that.
Seems like it. Plus, you see this emerging China-Russia alignment focused on tech sovereignty. They're working on alternatives.
Like a BRICS digital stack.
Exactly. Promoting Huawei Cloud. Actively trying to create alternatives to U.S.-dominated systems, which could, fragment global tech standards.
So the outlook on tech is...
The U.S. is strongly positioned to lead what the report calls techno-imperialism, shaping global tech and standards. But it needs to actively work to stop that fragmentation.
Okay, moving on. Cultural power. The empire of ideas. Still relevant.
The report thinks so, yeah. It considers its persistent role.
And the assets are still there. Media, entertainment.
Undeniable cultural assets. Hollywood, Netflix, YouTube, even platforms like TikTok, despite the ownership questions. Global reach.
Higher education, too.
Key asset. The report notes the U.S. still hosts, 17 of the world's top 20 universities? That attracts global talent, influences global thought.
17 out of 20, wow.
And that startup and freedom narrative, the American dream idea, still has appeal globally, the report suggests.
But challenges exist here, too.
For sure, real challenges. Persistent anti-American sentiment in parts of the global South, post-colonial spheres.
And divisions at home?
Yeah, the internal cultural bifurcation, as the report puts it. That potentially dilutes the strength of a single, unified American ideology to export.
Plus more competition now, right?
Definitely growing competition in the cultural space. The Korean wave, Bollywood, African pop, Latin American content, all gaining huge global traction, challenging U.S. dominance in certain areas.
So the outlook for cultural power
Likely remains a primary cultural exporter, but facing much more competition from these strong regional identity hubs, creating their own global hits. Less of a monopoly.
Okay. So all these individual dimensions, political, economic, military, tech, cultural, they're all playing out within this larger shift, right? The report says we're not in a unipolar world anymore.
Exactly. That's fundamental to the whole analysis. It's now a multipolar order. The U.S. empire, or whatever form it takes, has to navigate this landscape of fluid coalitions and key competitors.
And the report actually categorizes these competitors.
It assigns threat levels and identifies their strategic tools. China is labeled a high threat, leveraging trade, surveillance tech, the Belt and Road Initiative, and that rapidly growing Navy.
Okay.
India is seen as a medium threat, leveraging its huge population, developing digital public goods infrastructure, and playing the non-alignment card diplomacy-wise.
Interesting. And the EU?
The EU is categorized as a low threat militarily, but it wields significant influence through regulations.
Like GDPR.
Exactly. And leadership on global issues like climate change, regulatory power.
And Russia.
Russia is also seen as low threat overall, long-term power, projection-wise, though highly disruptive, obviously, via cyber, energy leverage, but operating from a weakening economic base, according to the report.
So the U.S. has to navigate between these different blocks, G7 versus BRICS, plus Indo-Pacific versus Eurasia.
Exactly. It's a much more complex chessboard than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Much more fluid.
So given all that analysis, the report doesn't just stop there. It looks ahead, presents possible scenarios for 2045.
Yeah, it lays out 4 possible scenarios and even assigns probabilities based on its assessment, which is always a bit bold.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the most probable?
The most probable, given a 50% chance, is what it calls Resilient Empire 2.0. This sees continued tech-led dominance, that more selective but still potent military we talked about, and ongoing cultural sway, kind of a transformed but still leading role.
Okay, 50%. What's next?
Then there's the multipolar world scenario at 30% probability. In this future, the U.S. is seen as primus inter pares.
First among equals.
Right, operating among several strong, independent regional powers. Not the single dominant force, but still very influential. A scenario called managed decline. This is where the U.S. strategically pulls back, focuses mainly on the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific. That's given a 15% probability.
And the least likely.
Finally, the least likely, just 5% probability, is fragmentation or isolation. This is where some kind of severe internal crisis leads to a really significant reduction in the U.S.'s global role altogether.
Okay, quite a range of possibilities. So based on all this, the challenges, the potential futures, the report ends with policy recommendations.
Yeah, 5 key recommendations for the U.S. to consider if it wants to navigate this trajectory effectively.
Let's tick through them.
First, invest in domestic renewal. Infrastructure, education, social cohesion, framed as fundamental national security imperatives. Fix the home base.
Makes sense. Second,
Maintain and deepen alliance ecosystems. NATO, RUKIS, the QAGA. These are seen as critical force multipliers.
third,
Secure tech supply chains. Specifically, reducing that dependency on Taiwan for chips and on places like China for critical minerals.
fourth recommendation.
Reform immigration policies to keep attracting global talent, seen as absolutely crucial for sustaining that innovation edge we discussed.
Right, the brains behind the innovation. And fifth,
take a leadership role in AI governance. Work to establish global norms, global frameworks, before other powers, maybe China, fill that vacuum with their own standards.
Get ahead of the curve on AI rules. Okay. So bringing all together then, the report's central conclusion really lands back on that initial thesis, doesn't it?
It does. The U.S. empire isn't collapsing, but it's fundamentally transforming. Less physical control, more. That empire of protocols, platforms, and persuasion.
It's a powerful reframing.
And the key question the report leaves us with, really, is whether the U.S.'s capacity for adaptation technologically, politically, culturally will be enough to keep it as the central node in the global system. Or
Or will it become just one powerful player among several others in a much more crowded world?
that's the core question, yeah.
Okay. So, given this deep dive into how the report sees the U.S. shifting towards influence via networks, tech, soft power, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to consider based purely on what we've discussed today.
Mm.
How might the report's vision of this empire of protocols directly influence aspects of your own interconnected life? Or maybe conversely, where might that tension between the U.S.'s internal challenges in the politics, the economics, and its global ambitions play out in surprising or unexpected ways over the next couple of decades? Something to chew on.